92%. That figure is not speculation, and it is not based on personal belief. It comes directly from decades of FBI crime statistics, thousands of homicide investigations, and some of the largest studies ever conducted on violent offenders in the United States. When forensic psychologist Dr. Gary Brucato spoke with Brian Enton about the disappearance and death of Nancy Guthrie, he brought up that statistic openly. And the moment he connected it to this case, the entire situation took on a different meaning. Not because the statistic itself is shocking or newly discovered. Researchers and criminal investigators have known it for years. But when you place that number beside the details of this case, an 84-year-old woman taken from her Tucson, Arizona home on January 31st, it points investigators toward a very narrow set of possibilities. According to the data, 92% of homicide victims in the United States had some form of relationship or familiarity with the person responsible for their death. That single fact changes how cases like this are viewed. This is Closing the Case, a channel dedicated to examining criminal cases with accuracy and depth. Every statement presented in this video is backed by verified sources, all linked in the description below. If you are new to the channel, subscribe and enable notifications, because Dr. Brucato's assessment may be one of the clearest and most detailed forensic breakdowns released so far regarding Nancy Guthrie's case. By the end of this video, you may understand aspects of the investigation that many people still overlook. But before discussing his conclusions, it is important to understand who Dr. Gary Brucato is and why his opinion carries weight. Dr. Gary Brucato is a forensic psychologist, clinical researcher, and criminal behavior specialist. He serves as a visiting scholar at Boston College and is also part of the expert panel for the Cold Case Foundation. Dr. Gary Brucato is not the type of expert who builds his reputation from television appearances or true crime documentaries. His career has been built through years of forensic research, criminal behavioral analysis, and the study of violent offenders. He is the co-author of The New Evil, Understanding the Emergence of Modern Violent Crime, a landmark book examining the evolution of extreme violence in modern America, and he also helped develop Columbia University's mass murder database, one of the most extensive psychological research projects ever conducted on mass killers and violent criminals. This is someone who has spent decades studying real case files, statistical patterns, and the psychology behind why people commit acts of violence. Before Brian Kohberger was arrested in the Idaho student murders, Brucato publicly described a profile of the likely suspect that later aligned closely with details revealed by investigators. So when he began speaking about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, people paid attention. What makes this case especially disturbing is how ordinary everything appeared before Nancy vanished. Nancy Ellen Long Guthrie was 84 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and had lived a quiet life in Tucson, Arizona's Catalina foothills for more than 50 years. After losing her husband in a mining accident in Mexico, she raised her 3 children largely on her own and eventually settled into a peaceful routine surrounded by family, neighbors, and church friends. Her oldest daughter is Savannah Guthrie, the well-known NBC Today show anchor, while her other daughter Annie is married to Italian-born musician Tommaso Cajan. Her son Cameron also remained close to the family. To outsiders, Nancy's life looked stable, predictable, and safe. But investigators already understood something critical that many people following the case did not fully grasp. Nancy was medically fragile. She had a pacemaker, required daily medication, and according to Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos, she could not walk even 50 yards on her own without difficulty. That detail becomes extremely important when examining the timeline of her disappearance. On January 31st, a Tuesday evening, nothing seemed unusual. Nancy spent the night having dinner with Annie and Tommaso at their home. It was described as a normal family evening with no visible signs of tension or concern. At 9:48 p.m., Tommaso drove Nancy home and later stated that he personally walked her to the front door and watched her go inside before leaving. For several hours afterward, everything appeared quiet. Then, at exactly 1:47 a.m., the case changed dramatically. Nancy's doorbell camera captured a masked figure standing outside her home. The person was wearing nitrile gloves, carrying a small backpack, and appeared strangely calm. There was no panic or hesitation in their movements. Instead, The individual carefully reached toward the camera and covered the lens using foliage taken from a nearby potted plant on the porch, suggesting deliberate and controlled behavior rather than a random act. At that exact same moment, Nancy's pacemaker recorded a sudden cardiac spike. Her heart rate surged sharply, and the medical device automatically documented the event with a precise timestamp. Investigators believe this may represent the exact moment fear or physical distress entered the situation. Then, at 2:28 a.m., the pacemaker suddenly stopped transmitting data after disconnecting from its bedside wireless monitor. No further signals were ever received. Just 8 minutes later, at 2:36 a.m., a Ring camera located roughly 2.5 miles away on Camino Royale captured a vehicle believed to resemble a Kia Soul traveling south toward the Mexican border, approximately 60 miles away. That became the final known electronic trace connected to the case. Now, more than 100 days later, in May 2026, Nancy Guthrie still has not been found. There has been no confirmed sighting, no recovered body, no arrests, and no criminal charges filed. The investigation remains filled with unanswered questions, and that uncertainty is exactly why Dr. Gary Brucato's analysis drew so much attention. Rather than relying on speculation, he approached the case through behavioral science, homicide statistics, and decades of forensic research designed to determine whether this was truly a random crime, or whether Nancy Guthrie was taken by someone who already knew her. When Dr. Gary Brucato began analyzing the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, he did not immediately focus on who may have taken her. Instead, he approached the case the way experienced forensic investigators often do, by eliminating the explanations that simply do not fit the evidence. In forensic psychology, ruling out the impossible is often the fastest path toward the truth, and according to Brucato, the first theory that collapsed under scrutiny was sexual motivation. This point has surfaced repeatedly in online discussions surrounding the case, but Dr. Brucato addressed it directly and without hesitation. In his assessment, there was no evidence suggesting the crime was sexually motivated. His conclusion was not based on instinct or assumption, but on documented criminal behavior patterns and decades of psychological research. He specifically referenced a rare paraphilia known as gerontophilia, which refers to sexual attraction toward elderly individuals. According to Brucato, offenders driven by this type of motivation almost never appear as isolated one-time criminals. They typically display serial behavior, targeting multiple elderly victims over time and leaving behind recognizable patterns investigators can track. That pattern simply did not exist in Tucson. There were no previous attacks involving elderly women that matched the circumstances surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. No connected incidents. No escalating series of crimes. No behavioral signature pointing toward a serial predator operating in the area. But beyond the statistics and offender psychology, the physical evidence inside Nancy's home pushed investigators even further away from any sexual motive. Authorities reportedly found no biological evidence consistent with sexual assault and none of the psychological fantasy elements that commonly appear in sexually driven crimes. In cases like those, offenders often leave behind signs connected to their obsessions or compulsions, details that fulfill whatever fantasy is motivating the attack. According to Brucato, none of those indicators were present. For him, the sexual motive theory was effectively eliminated. The next possibility he examined was robbery. At first glance, it may sound reasonable. An elderly woman living alone in an affluent neighborhood could appear vulnerable to someone searching for money, jewelry, or valuables. But once investigators looked closer, that theory began falling apart almost immediately. Nothing of value had been taken from the home. Think about the implications of that for a moment. Whoever appeared at Nancy Guthrie's house arrived prepared. The individual wore gloves, carried equipment, concealed their identity, and moved with purpose. Yet despite all of that preparation, valuables inside the house were reportedly left untouched. That detail matters enormously. People who break into homes to steal usually leave with something: cash, electronics, jewelry, safes, anything that can quickly be converted into money. But in Nancy's case, the evidence suggested the intruder's objective was never the property itself. The target appeared to be Nancy. Still, Dr. Brucato continued working through the possibilities. If this was not sexually motivated and not a robbery, could it have been a kidnapping for ransom? Unlike burglary, ransom kidnapping is not centered on physical items inside a house. The victim becomes the valuable asset. But according to Brucato's research into abduction cases, ransom crimes follow a highly predictable timeline. In most genuine ransom kidnappings, demands are made within the first 24 to 48 hours. Not weeks later. Not months later. Almost immediately. The reason is simple. The longer abductors keep a victim alive, the greater the risk of detection, exposure, and capture. Brucato described kidnapping victims as precious cargo. In financial abduction cases, the offender's goal is to preserve that cargo long enough to collect payment and then eliminate risk as quickly as possible. Because of that, real ransom kidnappings almost always include proof of life. Kidnappers must convince the family and authorities that the victim is alive, unharmed, and worth negotiating for. Without proof, there is no leverage and no payment. But in Nancy Guthrie's case, none of those elements ever appeared. By the time Dr. Brucato publicly discussed the investigation, Nancy had already been missing for more than 100 days. Law enforcement had confirmed no verified ransom demand, no credible communication from abductors, and no confirmed proof that Nancy was still alive. Even more concerning, Nancy had disappeared without her medication despite having a serious cardiac condition and reliance on a pacemaker. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, the possibility of a traditional ransom kidnapping became harder and harder to support. And that left investigators facing a far more disturbing question. If this was not about sex, money, or random theft, then what was the real motive behind Nancy Guthrie's disappearance? None of the known evidence fit the profile of a victim being kept alive for ransom. Nancy Guthrie disappeared without her medication despite suffering from a serious heart condition and relying on a pacemaker, and for more than 100 days there was no verified communication from any captor, no proof of life, and no credible ransom demand confirmed by law enforcement. According to Dr. Gary Brucato, that alone placed the case far outside the established behavioral patterns seen in documented ransom kidnappings. In real abduction-for-profit cases, victims are treated as valuable assets that offenders need to preserve long enough to collect money. Keeping an elderly woman with major medical vulnerabilities hidden for months without communication simply does not align with how those crimes operate in the real world. By that point in his analysis, Brucato had already eliminated sexual motivation and robbery. Ransom kidnapping, in his view, also failed to fit the evidence. That left investigators facing a much darker category. Dr. Brucato then turned his attention to abduction itself as a standalone crime, and the numbers immediately revealed how unusual this case truly was. According to the research he referenced, there are only around 350 abductions annually across the entire United States. Across all 50 states, that averages to fewer than one abduction per day nationwide. But the statistic becomes even more striking when age is considered. The overwhelming majority of those cases involve children, not elderly adults. An 84-year-old woman being forcibly taken from her home is statistically rare under almost any circumstance. But Brucato did not stop with the rarity of the crime itself. He examined what the data consistently showed about the offenders involved in these cases, and one pattern emerged again and again. In most documented abductions, the perpetrator already knew the victim in some capacity. Sometimes the relationship was close. Sometimes it was casual. But statistically, some prior connection usually existed. And then Brucato connected that pattern to homicide data. Because once sexual motivation, robbery, and ransom are removed from the equation, investigators are left confronting another possibility entirely. An elderly woman with severe medical issues disappears in the middle of the night, vanishes for more than 3 months, and no verified proof of life ever surfaces. According to Brucato, that combination increasingly points toward probable homicide. That is when he introduced the statistic that completely reframed the case. Drawing from multiple national homicide studies discussed during his interview with Brian Enton, Dr. Brucato explained that between 76% and 92% of homicide victims in the United States knew the person responsible for their death in some way. The higher figure, 92%, comes from some of the most comprehensive modern analyses of national homicide data ever conducted. 92%. Not half. Not a strong possibility. An overwhelming statistical pattern. And Brucato was careful to explain what knowing actually means in criminal investigations. It does not necessarily mean family. It does not require friendship or emotional closeness. The connection could be surprisingly minor. It could involve a contractor who once worked on the home, a delivery driver familiar with the address, a medical worker, a service technician, someone seen regularly at a grocery store, or simply a person Nancy recognized from previous encounters. The relationship could be intimate or fleeting, but according to the data, it most likely existed. When investigators apply that number to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the implications become difficult to ignore. Statistically speaking, the person who came to her home that night had likely crossed paths with her before. Then Dr. Brucato focused on the detail that has haunted this investigation from the very beginning: the masked figure captured on Nancy's doorbell camera. What stood out to him was not only the disguise or the gloves. It was the behavior. The person on that porch appeared unervingly calm. According to Brucato, the individual was way too cool under pressure. To understand why that observation matters, you have to understand how stress usually appears during criminal acts. Even experienced offenders, career criminals who have committed crimes repeatedly, still display involuntary physiological reactions while in the middle of an offense. Elevated heart rate, rushed movements, nervous scanning, repeatedly looking over the shoulder, fumbling under pressure. These are common behavioral responses driven by fear of getting caught. The body reacts automatically, whether the offender wants it to or not. But the figure on Nancy Guthrie's camera showed almost none of those signs. The movements appeared controlled, measured, and unusually composed. The person did not rush while covering the camera lens. There was no visible panic, no frantic behavior, no hesitation. To Dr. Brucato, that level of calmness potentially pointed towards something much more concerning: a psychopathic personality structure, someone capable of operating under extreme pressure without displaying the normal signs of fear or emotional stress. And if that assessment is correct, it changes how investigators may need to view every second captured on that camera. Dr. Gary Brucato believed one of the most revealing details in the Nancy Guthrie case was not what the masked figure did on camera, but what they did not do. Most people watching the footage focused on the disguise, the gloves, or the fact that the individual approached the home in the middle of the night. Brucato focused on something deeper: the complete absence of visible fear. According to him, that level of calmness could point towards psychopathic personality traits. Psychopathy is not a casual insult or internet buzzword. Clinically, it refers to a specific group of behavioral characteristics that include lack of empathy, absence of remorse, manipulative tendencies, and most importantly in this case, a severely blunted fear response. People with genuine psychopathic traits often process danger differently from the average person. Situations that would trigger anxiety, panic, or hesitation in most individuals may produce little emotional reaction in them at all. That, according to Brucato, could explain why the person on Nancy Guthrie's porch appeared so composed while preparing to commit a serious crime. The figure did not rush, did not repeatedly scan the surroundings, and did not display the frantic body language investigators typically see in offenders caught under pressure. The behavior looked controlled, almost emotionally detached. But Brucato emphasized something equally important that many viewers overlooked: people with psychopathic character structures rarely appear out of nowhere. These personalities leave trails behind them over years, sometimes decades. Their behavior tends to create memorable incidents, disturbing encounters, explosive confrontations, manipulative relationships, or prior criminal activity that eventually brings them into contact with law enforcement. Psychopathy is not something that suddenly develops overnight. It is a long behavioral pattern that builds over time and leaves evidence in the lives of other people. According to Brucato, whoever appeared on that porch likely had a documented history somewhere in the system already. Maybe arrests, maybe violent disputes, maybe repeated complaints from people who encountered them in daily life. But almost certainly, records existed. Then Brucato highlighted another psychological pattern that opened a very specific avenue for investigators. Research shows that individuals with psychopathic traits are often more reactive to perceived disrespect than to actual threats against them. It sounds counterintuitive, but studies repeatedly show that these personalities can become explosively angry over relatively minor insults. Being challenged, embarrassed, ignored, corrected, or made to feel disrespected can trigger reactions wildly disproportionate to the situation itself. Brucato described the type of person many communities already recognize immediately once investigators begin asking questions. The man who erupts into rage because someone cut him off in traffic. The customer who screams at employees over trivial amounts of money. The individual who carries grudges for years over incidents most people would forget within hours. These encounters stick in people's memories because the reactions feel abnormal and deeply unsettling. That is why Brucato believed investigators should focus heavily on people in the Tucson area who had a history of volatile confrontations or long-standing grudges. Witnesses may not remember every face they encounter, but they remember people who made them uncomfortable, frightened, or intimidated. Those behavioral signatures tend to stay with people for years. But then Brucato's analysis took an even more fascinating turn. Despite the figure's eerie calmness, he believed the person captured on camera also made several obvious mistakes. Mistakes that suggested they were far from a sophisticated criminal mastermind. The holster visible in the footage appeared to be worn incorrectly, positioned in a way that could actually endanger the wearer. The firearm itself did not even appear to properly match the holster, something Brucato interpreted as a sign that the individual lacked genuine familiarity with weapons despite carrying one. Then there was the strange detail involving foliage or flowers apparently brought to the house. Brucato openly questioned why anyone planning a serious crime would do something so bizarre. In his own words, "Unless you are an absolute imbecile, why would you do that?" He suggested the answer may only make sense once investigators fully understand the motive and circumstances behind what happened that night. And perhaps most importantly, the person allowed themselves to be captured on camera in the first place. According to Brucato, a truly skilled offender with operational experience would likely have disabled, bypassed, or avoided the surveillance system entirely before approaching the property. Instead, the individual walked directly into view. That contradiction became one of the most important aspects of his analysis. The suspect appeared emotionally cold enough to stand calmly in front of a security camera while preparing to commit a violent act, yet careless enough to make elementary mistakes that experienced criminals typically avoid. Brucato described the offender as someone who may not have been particularly intelligent, but who was still capable of serious violence, someone comfortable with harming others, yet not highly skilled at carrying out crimes cleanly. And that contradiction led him toward what may be the most disturbing conclusion in the entire case. Dr. Brucato did not believe the person on camera acted alone. To explain his theory, he used an analogy that investigators and viewers immediately remembered. He described the masked individual as the waiter, the visible person, the one standing in front of the camera, the one delivering the meal. But according to Brucato, the waiter was not the one who designed the plan. Somewhere behind the scenes, he believed, there was also the chef, the real planner, the organizer, the person who understood the objective, directed the operation, and potentially never appeared on camera at all. Dr. Gary Brucato's analysis of the Nancy Guthrie case suggests this was not a random crime, but a carefully planned operation likely driven by financial motives. According to him, the person captured on Nancy's security camera was probably not the mastermind, but rather the visible waiter carrying out instructions from a hidden chef, someone intelligent, organized, and socially trusted within Nancy's circle. Brucato believes the true orchestrator likely appeared kind, normal, and even helpful to Nancy, while secretly having a financial reason to want her gone, whether connected to inheritance, assets, caregiving burdens, or information she may have known. He linked this theory to what he calls elimination murder, a type of crime in which a victim is removed because they stand in the way of something the perpetrator wants. Brucato pointed out that the scene at Nancy's home appeared staged. Nothing valuable was stolen, there were no signs of sexual assault, and details like the open back door and blood evidence may have been designed to create the illusion of a random abduction. In his view, the crime scene contained surface-level signs of intrusion but lacked the real motivational elements usually seen in genuine robberies or sexually motivated crimes. He even stated publicly that Nancy may not have been killed or abducted inside the home at all, suggesting parts of the scene could have been manipulated afterward to mislead investigators. He also analyzed the behavior of the masked figure caught on camera. The individual appeared unusually calm under pressure, something Brucato associated with psychopathic personality traits such as lack of fear, lack of empathy, and emotional detachment. However, despite that calmness, the suspect also made several amateur mistakes, including improperly wearing a holster, carrying a mismatched firearm, bringing strange items like foliage or flowers to the property, and allowing themselves to be captured on camera in the first place. According to Brucato, this combination suggested someone comfortable with violence but not highly intelligent or professionally trained. The investigation's strongest hope, he believes, lies in forensic evidence. Mixed DNA samples, a recovered glove, and a hair found at the scene are all being analyzed by the FBI. Once individual DNA profiles are isolated, investigators can use genealogical databases, the same technology that identified the Golden State Killer, to trace relatives and narrow suspects through family trees. Renowned genetic genealogist C.C. Moore has reportedly been connected to the forensic work in the case, which Brucato sees as a major sign that progress is being made behind the scenes. Brucato also believes the perpetrator is local to Tucson and had direct or indirect access to Nancy's life, home, schedule, and vulnerabilities. Statistically, he argues, people who commit crimes like this almost always exist within the victim's social or geographic orbit. Reports of ransom-style messages were also discussed, but Brucato noted that if such communications were genuine, they may have been sent for psychological reasons rather than financial ones, to manipulate, taunt, or maintain attention. He emphasized that offenders with psychopathic or narcissistic traits often cannot resist remaining connected to the story even when silence would better protect them. Ultimately, Brucato believes more than one person was involved and that conspiracies like this often collapse once one participant is identified or arrested. With a $1 million reward still unclaimed, he noted that accomplices frequently turn on each other when facing prison or financial pressure. His final suspect profile describes one visible offender with a history of aggression and criminal behavior, and another hidden organizer who appears trustworthy and socially normal while secretly living what he called a double life. Despite the disturbing nature of the case, Brucato ended with confidence that it will eventually be solved. He explained that modern DNA genealogy and patient investigative work have solved cases that remained mysteries for decades, and he believes the evidence in Nancy Guthrie's disappearance will eventually lead investigators to the truth. Meanwhile, Nancy's family continues living with the pain of uncertainty, knowing that the last normal family dinner they shared with her on January 31st ended with her vanishing into silence only hours later.